So, as was introduced, my name is Adrienne Peters, and I'll be presenting this morning on behalf of my co-presenters and co-authors, Laura Squires and Dr. Linda Rohr. And as stated, I'll be talking about teaching for change, borrowing from the lovely title of the conference, through tweeting to enhance critical digital media literacy. So, basically, a lot of our work that we've been doing in this area is related to the use of Twitter in an academic context and post-secondary learning. So, having a very hard time maneuvering here. Okay, there we go, sorry. So with the prevalence of digital media today in our everyday lives and activities, which has become, of course, increasingly pronounced with the growth of social media, and then also during and then since the pandemic, social media, more specifically, does contribute to shaping our knowledge, beliefs, and values, as well as our overall worldview. So, social media platforms such as microblogging tools like Twitter allow users to be both consumers of information and also producers of online knowledge. And this increased reliance on digital and social media has thus changed how we process information and learn, which has now become an interactive process that is largely rooted in the idea of cultivating our own education. So, social media has become a dominant source of news and information for students in today's kind of global village. And many discussions, debates, and experiences and expressions of identities now take place in online and often very public forums. And so these forms of knowledge available through these various platforms and sources on these, however, have never been more diverse and also polarized as we see. Critical digital media literacy and education on it is therefore really valuable for students and for all of us, as it recognizes that media shapes social thought and that students should question the purpose of media, what it is used, why it is used, and its impact on society. And so, as young people are among the most active age demographic on social media and in a lot of digital media platforms, critical digital media literacy can be vital for teaching students how to critically think about and analyze information disseminated to determine what is legitimate and why. So, given the literature and our interest in these topics, our work examines the use of Twitter, assessing and developing students' critical digital media literacy. So, both their understanding of what this means, what we're looking at, and its application and execution, and then also how improvements can potentially be made in terms of how we use technology, such as social media and Twitter, for this purpose. So to explore these themes, my colleagues and I, we implemented Twitter activities or events, we called them, and these were actually assignments. So as part of class discussion and course evaluations in a human kinetics and recreation, and also criminology courses at Munnell, so two introductory courses at Memorial. And as these two courses, so HKR and criminology, were chosen, given that's the areas in which myself and one of my co-presenters teach in, but also it's two common themes that we often talk about and hear about in the media and talk about on social media is health, wellness, and crime. And so the objective of this, the integration of Twitter, was to encourage scholarly online conversations around these themes related to health and wellness and what students are learning in introductory HKR course, and then also, excuse me, around crime within the criminology course. And also, in addition to this, we're also trying to foster interaction, inclusion, a sense of belonging, and then also another primary goal is to combine teaching introductory content while also developing and practicing critical thinking skills at an early stage for students through the application of course material to real world issues. And so today I will share our content analysis results from students' tweets in HKR 1000 with a few preliminary notes from our criminology findings as well. And then I will also present our preliminary thematic analysis results from our Crim 1001 introductory crim course, exploring the content types and themes. And also, we're going to also look later at the news sources and political orientations of news stories that students select and examine in these assignments. So Sorry, I just saw the comment about full screen mode. I hope everyone's able to see it, and I apologize for having it in this mode. It's because my notes are in a different format, and that's the reason. If there's issues seeing it, however, I can try to do that. But I will continue if I don't hear otherwise. Okay, yeah, so to answer our questions, as I noted, to assess students' critical thinking skills and whether and how Twitter can be used in teaching and learning critical digital media literacy, we employed mixed methodology. So using quantitative content analysis, as I just mentioned, which measured students' level of analysis in their tweets. So from personal opinion and general statements to thoughtful application of course content and demonstrated critical thinking. And then also our qualitative thematic analysis, which involved the coding of identified themes in students' actual tweets in terms of their wording, their language, their ideas, and the stories they're selecting. So the quantitative data has been entered into SPSS, and just basic descriptive percentage and frequency data are reported for the purpose of the presentation today. We've also developed and administered pre and post Twitter use surveys that we administered using the online platform Brightspace. And these were used to assess students' understanding of what critical thinking means to them and their understanding of this and experience in practicing it. However, this data will be part of a future presentation of paper, so we encourage you to keep your eyes out for that. Ethics was also obtained through Memorial University through iCare for each of these surveys. So as stated, we're still completing the analysis of the surveys and entering that data. And so today we're just presenting more so some of the qualitative information and data. So we don't have sample demographics for the tweet data used in our presentation today just yet. But to provide more background in terms of who these students are, so the sample for our study was composed of students enrolled in one online section of Introductory Human Kinetics and Recreation, so HKR 1000, and one section of Introductory Criminology, so CRIM, also cross-listed as SOC 1001, so both delivered at Memorial University in 2021. So HKR 1000, Fitness and Wellness, is a popular elective course for the broad university student community. It's actually widely subscribed to by a number of students outside of even HKR, as it introduces students in the concepts of fitness and wellness and the relationship among physical activity, fitness, wellness, quality of life, and longevity. And then criminology, process as Sociology 1001, Intro to Criminology, is a lower level course offered exclusively online in the Department of Sociology that is widely taken and required by our criminology students at Memorial University. And it introduces students to criminological and sociological models, as well as research methods for understanding the phenomena of crime. And so, as I noted, part of the evaluation in each course required students to complete 3 unique Twitter assignments, with each of these assignments asking students to locate credible news stories. Oftentimes we suggest like a local focus or something that they're able to relate to, but otherwise it's also open. And so any credible news stories, or that they perceive to be credible news stories, that pertain to one or more of the themes identified in that week of the course that we were covering content on. And then they were asked to craft and post one original tweet. Including the URL or link to the news story that they found, and then linking that story and its themes to the content for that course for that week. And then they were also required to also post one response tweet to another student's post, applying a theoretical framework or perspective in demonstrating how this kind of fits in explaining this phenomenon which they're examining. So to move into the preliminary results, as I noted, we call this the quality of the tweets. So to see how students performed and executed this task, here we were looking at the quantitative results from 2021 from HKR 1000 only. And so these bars that you see on the screen represent the level of critical thinking that was demonstrated in students' tweets that we measured and coded based on 5 developed kind of critical thinking categories that we had developed that actually mirrored really well kind of this continuum that exists within health literacy that fits within our themes as well. And this is indicating whether students' tweets fell under basically summary or general statements by the students, was the first category. The second category was personal statements. The third being summary and explicit mention of course concepts. The fourth being some sort of semblance of critical thinking. And then the fifth category was critical thinking as well as personalization, so including some sort of personal connection or statements within that. And so these categories we developed, they were developed pretty organically and inductively, following a general review of the tweets by myself and my research team to determine which categories were kind of present. And coding for critical thinking, which is what we're trying to assess here, would indicate that students have a higher level of health related and online digital media literacy than those who just summarize the information, for example, that's found in an article. So similar to when we're thinking about like students writing papers, I guess, for example. So summarizing equates in our minds a lesser indication of like digital media literacy and critical media literacy, or thinking critically about the content in terms of its reliability, validity, and theoretical kind of approach or methodology, and how the information is presented in the news article or the news media. And these categories of quality were then placed within a continuum within, again, like I mentioned, the health literacy literature that also looks at the ability of individuals to think critically and then also operationalize that information. So if we look at these results, then we can see some differences. So these are each bar represents a different semester, and then how many of the tweets reflected summary to personalization to then summary and direct links to the course concepts. So if they actually mentioned some course themes. So the first two categories, there was no connection to the course necessarily, or no explicit mention of the course or any citations from course resources or material. And then when we get into the latter two, then we start to see some introduction of course concepts, and then the last one being also the integration of critical thinking. So we can see that students have a very strong capacity to engage in conversation and post tweets on Twitter, as seen from the summary general statements, just the number of tweets, and then also the percentages that are represented by those categories. And then we can see it starts to taper off as the expectation is becoming higher to demonstrate some level of critical thinking. And it does vary, it fluctuates from semester to semester, of course, so that also indicates, of course, differences within classes and students' experiences potentially coming into the course. But nonetheless, most certainly there's some work to be done in terms of trying to kind of get students to that next level in terms of how they're critically thinking about what it is that they're consuming both online and then also in our courses. We also found a similar pattern in the preliminary results from our criminology courses, in that the majority of students were really keen and really able, I guess, to use Twitter and engage in these Twitter events and activities. Yet it did take some time as well to have that critical thinking emerge. We did, however, see this start to happen, of course, across the course of the semester. So as I noted, there were 3 tweeting events, and with each one we did see improvement with the critical thinking, which demonstrates as well that students getting feedback and kind of being pushed a little bit more to think about what that actually means when we're asking for critical thinking does actually help them in being able to achieve that goal for the course and that assignment. So then to move into some of our preliminary thematic and content analysis results from the CRIM 1001 section, we found that students gravitated towards what's called trending, I guess, or hot topics and news stories that are ongoing. So a number of examples were ongoing sexual assault cases, for example, a lot of like racially based stories in terms of like BLM, Black Lives Matter, and the racialization of individuals and just groups and that occurs within the justice system. We found that students had challenges understanding and addressing, however, the assigned course theme for some of the Twitter events. So for example, they were asked to apply certain methodologies from that they learned in the course, and also legislation and specific policies, and also just the idea of policy development in the course, and asked to apply that to then ongoing news stories. And students demonstrated challenges with really kind of trying to integrate the methodological and or policy piece, which was part of the learning for the course. However, they were able to identify stories and I guess more broadly kind of state policy and research to understand, but they weren't using specific explicit terminology that was utilized in the course. One strength, however, that we found was that most students did appropriately apply criminological and or sociological theory in their tweets. So they seem to have a really strong grasp of that theoretical orientation, which is also a very large focus in the course, but couldn't quite do the same for the methodological or policy piece. And really that course is designed to have those three main, I guess, teaching goals as the focus for what students should kind of take away when they complete this course. And so so it's great. Personally, as a theory nerd, I'm very excited to see that students were able to apply theory so regularly, and we're also keen to do that, but they were still missing some of the other pieces in terms of the expectations around the assignment. Interestingly, as well, despite the course's presentation of criminological theory, as I just noted, is a big piece of that, which students did apply, the examination or assessment of general public assumptions was less so. So again, students were very quick to maybe accept the information that was being presented in the articles that they were reading from the news media literature. And so a lot of their ideas, it was really clear, seem to maybe more so reflect ideas that we hear in the news media, or even in like popular media through like television shows and movies, as opposed to our course content. And so our takeaway from that then is that they seem to demonstrate some more conservative or punishment oriented and traditional crime control ideas around justice and the legal system and responses to like crime, and especially more serious crimes such as sexual assaults or other forms of violence and offenses against persons and others. So we just noted that, for example, sexual assault, as I noted, was raised as an ongoing news story in various capacities, that students were tweeting about different cases around their communities, their province, their country, and the language just followed many that existing stereotypes rather than the language used in the course. So still some development needed there. And then also common assumptions around gender and sexual offending and victimization, high levels of support for deterrence-based responses. So a lot of it, which is in contradiction to some of the ideas that we talk about in class, but are very much in line with ideas presented often in popular media, as I mentioned, and also on social media and news media. And I'll come back to that maybe in the discussion to talk a little bit about that and what's going on with Twitter and the future of Twitter. And so what we're working on now, so this is part of an ongoing study that we've been working on for several years now. And with each iteration, we're basically taking our findings, integrating it into the course, and then seeing how it impacts students and continues to develop their critical thinking skills and their critical digital media literacy. And then as part of the ongoing analysis we're doing now as well, we're looking at the impact that COVID has had on students, and whether this was raised and mentioned by students in their tweets as well. So we're looking at two things basically here. First, the impact of COVID-19 on students' Twitter use itself. So whether there's any changes in how much they used it pre-post the pandemic, but then also how much they incorporated or integrated COVID in their selection of news stories, so whether it was presented in the news story and or how they integrate it within their assessment of a topic. So for example, looking at health-related themes in the HCare 1000 course, how they might have selected stories that were talked about how our health and that includes like mental, physical wellness have been impacted by the pandemic, and or so whether that was included in the stories that they're looking at and or what they're talking about in relation to the stories. So that's where we're headed next. And we're finding some interesting findings in relation to that. So we did see kind of an uptick in students' use of Twitter, and also some of our online communities during the pandemic. And also there were it was really pronounced in the HKR course, the number of stories that did actually touch on COVID. This was less pronounced in the criminology course, but nonetheless did start to show up in the tweets that students were making. So then to just move into some discussion and conclusions here. So our findings suggest that despite our course assignments and the expectations around critical thinking and its use, students had limited exposure to critical thinking. So prior to coming into these courses, it appeared. So limited understanding, we mean what actually is meant by critical thinking and how to practice or actually carry this out. And so, although students had limited exposure to critical thinking at the beginning of the semester, as I suggested earlier, improvement was demonstrated following the first Twitter event upon students receiving feedback from their teaching assistant or their instructor. And we noticed this in both the HKR and CRIM courses. And I think there was more pronounced improvement between the first and the second than even the second and third. And it was also evident even in the third that some students might have been tapering off in terms of even their citing of content. But yeah, so this is important though, as students who make critical thinking, like who fit into the critical thinking category and or personalization tweets are more capable of illustrating how they have operationalized these concepts that they're learning in both the HKR and CRIM courses, and how they're taking that information and knowledge that's being relayed to them in the course to connect that then also with what's being relayed to them in the media. And so therefore, when they fall towards that critical thinking part of kind of the critical digital media literacy continuum compared to students who make summary general statements, who are less capable of illustrating how they operationalize certain ideas. That's how we kind of measure this difference in the critical digital media literacy. And so as I noted, I've kind of come back to this in my discussion. So I'm not sure if anyone's following the world of Twitter as much as we do, but I'm sure many have heard that a very wealthy gentleman has purchased Twitter, Elon Musk, and the purpose of doing that was to kind of think about this notion of censorship and how knowledge is being presented and what information is being presented and or can be presented in digital media forms and social media. And so there's an ongoing debate now about what that will look like and what censorship even looks like in freedom of speech, and what should and shouldn't be posted. Because as I noted, a lot of our students did gravitate towards more conservative, traditional ideas around crime and crime control, for example, and even some things related to health that are not necessarily reflective of the literature, but more so what's being presented online. And thus, it's really interesting to think about who are kind of the gatekeepers to that knowledge, because as I mentioned, we are part of creating that through that interactive process. But also very much we know that the algorithms have also maybe beat our own algorithms and often dictate what we see and what we think as a result. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this shift in Twitter in terms of how it's being used and if people are still using it. Because one fear that's coming up in discussion is that people will start stepping back from Twitter as a platform because of this. I mean, I think that's ambitious. It's a pretty big platform. But that also raises questions around how we will use this then also in the future for our own teaching and learning purposes. And so going back to the preliminary themes from our thematic analysis, students' ideas and discussion points really reflect this increasing polarization of ideas, particularly around justice, as I noted, and that's my specialization in society today, and also this like political populism kind of that I'm talking about with like the Twitter and Elon Musk and trying to think about, who has ownership over these ideas and its presentation. And so a key takeaway from this study, we feel, is that post-secondary instructors should really consider greater reflection on their own expectations of students and their incoming skill sets. So we recommend that instructors potentially shift perhaps their expectations and really their assumptions is what I feel it might be of students' existing skill sets, and more so even their mastery of certain skill sets. So I think we often anticipate or assume that students are coming into our courses with a certain foundational level of training from either secondary education or even previous post-secondary courses they've taken, especially when they're coming into new courses. But when they're transitioning from high school, in particular at these introductory level courses, which most of the students are at that stage or within their first or second year of university, we're really seeing the need to take that time to understand where students are at in terms of their skill sets and their ability then to think about material. And so we recommend that thus instructors take this into account, and really try to respond to students' changing learning, but also personal needs, especially fitting into that health and wellness piece. So what is it that's contributing to students' ability to even engage in this learning process and engage in this critical thinking process? And then how can we provide them with stronger toolkits to then be able to engage in this critical digital media literacy? And so we always talk about like ideas around critical thinking, these expectations, but and we expect students to be able to perform in that way. But I think we don't spend sufficient time actually assessing their abilities in this way and then taking the time to practice it with them. And so this is an area we think that instructors may be able to devote time in lessons to actually carrying out activities together in the class or in small groups that meaningfully cultivate, I guess, these skill sets. So the values and skills that we're hoping to impart in our students to make them to learn and grow. So that is all for my presentation for today. And I will open it up to any questions or comments.
Thanks very much for that. I'm just, before we move on to questions, I just wanted to ask if any of your colleagues on this wanted to add. I guess
You're breaking up again there, Mark.
Sorry about that. I was just wondering if any of your colleagues on this wanted to weigh in on anything before we turn it over to questions. I think that would be Laura or Linda.
I think Laura might be on the line, yeah.
Yeah, I am here. I think Adrienne pretty much covered everything. As she mentioned briefly, this is like a 3-year-long research project, and we have written many papers and published papers about this, so there is a lot that we could talk about. But with regards to this presentation, I think Adrienne pretty much clued it up. But if you have any more specific questions, then we can definitely talk in excess about that.
All right, well, we do have a question coming in there. I guess you can see the question panel, so I'll let you chime in on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Anne. So Anne asked, where do instructors start learning to use Twitter as an instructional tool? So we have had so much support from CIDL at MUN. They have actually they have a number of documents that they actually prepared for the use of Twitter in courses, and they too have experience using Twitter. So there's actually a Twitter widget that they have developed. So it's really great to, I think, work with the Centers for Teaching and Learning at your institution to see if they have anything developed first that's already in place and are being used in other courses. And then you yourself can, of course, start playing on Twitter a little bit and or seeing how it functions. But a number of institutions actually have developed learning resources, both for instructors as well as students, to actually integrate this. Great question from Kimberly there as well. Have you ever had a negative response about privacy from students using Twitter for assignments? So one option that we offer to students, particularly in my courses, because they're criminology, so some of the students are there and they may already be working in some cases. So we saw that as well during the pandemic. Some professionals came back to take courses, so they were maybe more experienced or further along in their degree, but we're still taking an introductory course to go back. And so we offered the option in those cases, but then opened up to anyone once we started realizing this, the option to create like an alias so that students, they could use their personal accounts if they had a Twitter account already. they could create a secondary Twitter account for the purposes of this course specifically, or they could create an alias that they could share with the instructor privately to then engage in this assignment. And then in one rare case, I think it only occurred once, but I did have one student who was in a more specialized position with the police and just felt it was better just not to participate. So I let that student then kind of do like mock-up tweets to then submit to me privately just for the purposes of the assignment. So there's ways that you can, I guess, navigate that. But that is a question that we've toyed with ourselves very, very, very much in terms of what it means in terms of asking students to do this as part of a course requirement, and then the fact that it's in a public forum, of course. So that is something we're thinking about constantly. And also not only thinking about that, but also thinking about whether Twitter is the best tool to use or whether we want to use maybe other social media, say TikTok or Instagram, like those that are becoming more popular among the younger demographic. But we always gravitate back towards Twitter, and the impetus for actually selecting Twitter was because it is more of that kind of discussant kind of piece where there's more online discourse and it's more conversational about learning and knowledge, as opposed to our beautiful pictures on Instagram. But TikTok is something we've also been thinking about as well. But then if you then start requiring some imagery or pictures or videos, then what again are you asking students to then potentially reveal about themselves? Okay, so hopefully I'm answering everyone's questions, and certainly feel free to follow up if there's anything else. And Laura, also, if you want to chime in at any point. Oh, and Jane has also shared some info on using Twitter for courses there. Thank you, Jane. And Jane is super, super helpful. So I actually collaborated with Jane and Daphne at CITL, and they've been immensely, immensely helpful over the years with our work. And also their development of the Twitter widget as well for instructors to use, which does make it a little bit easier to then also pull the tweets to be able to grade them for the purposes of your course, or engage in some sort of research and analysis as we've been doing. Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. You mentioned a critical thinking skills gap. Was there any prevalence of students coming in with very limited knowledge or no access to Twitter, and they had to create an account for this?
In terms of their familiarity with Twitter, sorry, Mark?
Yeah. Did you get much in the way of lack of familiarity with Twitter in general? I know you talked about the critical thinking, but just using the platform.
Yeah, and that goes back to Anne's question as well. I mean, it's not only us as naive Twitter users. I also started as a naive Twitter user, but many of our students, yeah, as I noted, because like TikTok has become so popular, Instagram, those tend to be more commonly subscribed to by like the younger age demographic, which represents the greatest proportion of our introductory students. So most had familiarity with it to a certain extent, and or had older accounts maybe from when they were younger. But there were students who weren't familiar with Twitter, and I would say each semester there was a few handfuls of students who actually weren't familiar with Twitter. So that again can be really helpful for having those resources that have been developed by CITL, as Jane shared. But also that does require, again, so not only does it require the instructor to take some time to talk about critical thinking and what that means, but also to take some time to explain the use of Twitter, even explain to students why we selected Twitter. So this is Twitter, this is why we selected it as part of the course evaluation, and then here's how you can start using it. And so we do spend a little bit of time on that, and that was kind of a finding of some of our earlier research, was that we can't just assume that students have critical thinking skills, nor can we simply assume that they know how to use every social media platform, including Twitter. So we have started slowly integrating then a little bit more of an instructional piece for that at the beginning of the semester, and then also, of course, really for referring students to the resources from CITL.
Something I could also add there is that in HKR 1000 specifically, where it's an online asynchronous course, we actually implemented Q&A sessions with students. So we had 3 scheduled Q&A sessions before the first Twitter event, and then afterwards to discuss what the expectations are, to show them examples of how to do it. Once the first event happened, we looked at what students were talking about in the quality of the tweets, and then we provided examples of good versus bad quality tweets. so that students could see more of what we were hoping to get from them through the assignment. So that really helped, and students really liked that, especially where it is a self-directed learning course. So there's not much interaction, and it kind of helped to legitimize us, I think, as instructors and personalize us. And that kind of ties into Kimberly's comment here of, did we encourage tweeting between students as an additional way of communicating during class time? So we actually didn't have prescribed class time, I would say, but another portion of our research looked specifically at whether or not Twitter encouraged interaction and engagement between students in the online asynchronous environment. And we found that it really depends on individual students' motivation, but Twitter inherently did increase, or we would say promote, I guess, communication between students and also between the instructor. So if a student would pose a question about an assignment or about a topic, then it was a collaborative space for another student to hop in and provide some information, or we as instructors could also answer questions that way. And instead of emailing, students like sometimes more of an immediate response. So Twitter kind of allowed other students to provide that more immediate response and support. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
And yeah, the Q&A sessions, Kimberly, again, to your comment, they were excellent. We really found students loved those. We didn't just talk about the Twitter events in these Q&A sessions. We also talked about all of the other course assignments. So it's kind of more of an in-class type of style when we're taking direct questions and we're immediately able to answer them. And we've recorded these Q&A sessions. So if students weren't able to make that specific time, or if they had another class, then they could go back and review the Q&A session to see what they missed or if their question would have been answered. And that was really helpful, again, for providing examples of what we're looking for and clarifying expectations.
I have
Yeah.
another question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of motivators for participation here, and I apologize if this was included in your presentation. What in terms of evaluations, was it a more of a participation mark, or was quality taken into consideration there?
So we did take into account quality as well. In my courses, for example, we so there's 3 Twitter events throughout the semester, and each Twitter event was then worth 5% of the student's grade. And that's something we've also thought about, is how do you determine the amount assigned to each Twitter event and or the Twitter events overall in terms of the overall evaluation, to make it kind of meaningful for students and to motivate them to participate and engage in it. So each tweet was worth 5% or overall 15% in my courses. But also that's something we've looked at in another paper as well in terms of actual motivations for using Twitter. We did actually do a part of our survey that we talked about today is actually asking students, why do you use social media? What are your motivations for using Twitter specifically, and or other platforms? We do look at the motivations around it as well, that are like outside of even just the lovely promise of some extra grades or some rewards in a course. Laura, I'm not sure if you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, the literature overwhelmingly says that in order for students to participate in something like this, there has to be a motivation, like a grade, to get them to do so. So yeah, we also assigned grade points based on quality. So we had 2 tweets, a response tweet and then an original tweet that students would have to make. And each tweet in HK 1000 was worth 2%. So 1% was automatically given if they participated, and then the other 1% was based on the quality of the tweet, which is kind of how we developed the critical thinking category. So if students received higher marks in the quality, generally they exhibited more critical thinking. So it is only 1%, but it does help to place the tweets on a scale of quality, which I think is important, because a lot of, at least in my personal experience attending MUN, a lot of discussion components are just based on participation. So if you do it, you get an automatic grade. But where we're looking for the quality points here, we thought it was important to assign a quality scale of marks. And that seemed to go over pretty well. Did we explicitly discuss critical thinking skills and include those in a rubric for marking? So yes, we did. Initially during the first event, we just stated on the course shell that we're looking for critical thinking. We didn't dive too much into giving students a rubric for the first event. We just wanted to get the baseline of what their critical thinking skills were. And then with the additional Q&A sessions afterwards, we dove a little more into what exactly critical thinking is. And that's where we showed the examples of what's a good tweet, what's maybe a medium quality tweet. So looking at just the summary or general statement tweets, which would be the lower quality. So students are just recirculating the information that they have found and not really providing anything additional. And then here's the personalization or the direct reference to course concepts. That was good, but it wasn't really getting to the critical thinking. It just shows their capability to pull information more so. And then the good quality tweets were the ones that showed critical thinking. So we would provide examples based on past Twitter events of here's what we're looking for and here's how you get these really strong quality points. And generally, we did see a rise in grades received and also quality of the tweets after we had explained and very explicitly stated what we were looking for.
And unrelated to the question, but one thing we forgot to mention as well, or I did mention in the description of the Twitter events and the tweeting, we also have course hashtags. So in case anyone's not familiar with like Twitter, but you can connect all the tweets that are using the same hashtag as well. So yeah, we like the hashtags I use, for example, are just like hashtag Crim 1001, or like, I mean, if you go on my Twitter, you can see my Twitter account name on the screen there. And if you go on, you can see that, yeah, there's hashtags like Sochi 3290 or whatever it is. So then all students are also required to use that hashtag as part of that evaluation of the tweet. Because that's how we can locate their tweet to actually grade it and assess it. But also B, then that's how students can find the tweets as well. And they're all connected so that they can see others' tweets and know that it's part of the course. Yeah. So just to add that piece. So we were looking for them to include kind of course content, critical thinking, but then also the course hashtag within their tweets.
Which we understand is difficult to do in 240 characters, but that's kind of the challenge of the assignment as well, is to be concise and be able to make a very quick but worthy statement.
Any other questions or thoughts? Also, we'd be happy to share some of our work that we've already done, like I mentioned, in terms of some of the motivations that we've looked at, and students' own expectations around some of the assignments and our work, and then also some of the further work we've done with this notion of critical digital media literacy and what that means. Yeah, happy to share any of that, or please reach out anyone if you do have questions about how to maybe go about implementing this into your courses and assignments, and or just even thinking about it maybe preliminarily.
And maybe something I could add too, just to maybe justify why we chose Twitter instead of using like the D2L discussion tool. Because the D2L discussion tool, once you're finished your course, it kind of goes away, right? You don't really have the opportunity to continue to engage with students or maybe the instructor. But on Twitter, you can actually do that. You can make professional connections. You can continue to direct message people, or it's more of a dedicated space for social interaction and engagement as opposed to the discussion forum, which is viewed by students as a very academic space where they're more unlikely to provide additional contributions above what is required of them. So on Twitter, they can post as many tweets as they like. They can post as many tweets with the hashtag, but they may also find connections outside of the course. So some of our other work looks at interaction and engagement. So students may have the motivation to interact with other colleagues or students, but the course Discussion Shell doesn't provide that opportunity. So that was kind of why we chose Twitter more specifically as a dedicated social space to hopefully foster this interaction and engagement. But also, it's a media dedicated space. So when we're looking at critical digital media literacy, Twitter is full of that, whereas discussion shells are less so.
Okay, great questions, great answers. We have about 8 minutes left. For any more questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window. Otherwise, we may end up concluding a little bit early. So I'll just give you a second there in case anybody has any last minute thoughts. Got a couple more questions there.
That's a great question. I'm trying to think. There's been a lot of surprises. um, Initially, for me, the like when we first started the research, I guess, was just trying to understand how students use social media. I think, um, and I was surprised by how little some students actually use some social media, and or how 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 little they thought, I guess, about that, in terms of how if they were so how little some students engaged with it, and then how little sometimes students maybe even thought about their engagement with it for those who were even engaging in it, in terms of thinking about how they're represented in that online space, and then how their ideas are being represented, I think, which is again also a part of the goal with this assignment, is to really encourage individuals and our students to think about, yeah, what it means to participate in a public space that we often use to share very personal and private information, but also news stories and discussions and debates. And so, yeah, so I think that was a big surprise for me. And then also just a number of students who don't just use social media as we kind of like would have had expected or assumed, I guess. Laura, did you want to comment on what was surprising for you?
Yeah, so something I think that was most surprising for me was, I guess, I expected students to have a higher level of critical thinking than what we initially found. Just coming in, just due to the proliferation of social media, I expected students maybe to be a little more critical about what they're reading and the truthfulness, I guess, behind that information, just because we are in kind of an era of false news and things like that. So I really did expect to see the critical thinking categories to be a little higher. But reflecting on that, it's likely due to the age and year of students. So something we did look at in another paper was the breakdown of first year students quality versus maybe higher level students quality. And students who are in later years of university are much more capable of providing these critical thinking thoughts as opposed to students who are in younger years, like first year or second year. And saying this now, it seems very logical and maybe not like a surprise, but I did expect to see a higher number of students to be able to think critically. But I think this just shows the need for us to really, if we are going to require students to think critically about that information, we need to teach them how to do that, to be critical of the media that they're consuming, and that we need to really, instead of just assigning students work and hoping that they'll be able to do it, maybe we really need to take into account their capabilities to do so. So yeah, and also high school, I don't think really prepares students to think critically. So university, I think, is much more able to do that. So when students have more experience under their belt, then those higher level students are definitely better able to engage and to do what the assignments are asking of them, not just for the Twitter events, but throughout the course as well. HKR, we see students from all years because it is an open elective. So that was a little more pronounced, I think, in HKR than maybe crim courses because that they were more similar in year of study. Yeah. And I think Jane also mentioned where are we going to go with this. So we're currently working on we have 3 papers that we have done. Now we're working on 2 more papers, which is looking at like a media literacy landscape. So a lot of what we're doing and what we have done in the past is media literacy and critical digital media literacy, which are kind of one of the same. So we're going to post, or we're hoping to work on a paper about just our experience with media literacy and what the landscape looks like for university students. And then we're going to dive more into the actual content of the tweets more so than the quality. So the quality was really important, but now we're going to look at what topics do students most ascribe to and what are they most likely to post about. So in HKR 1000 specifically, mental wellness was one of the most talked about topics over the pandemic. And that was also in relation to the pandemic. So we're going to talk about that. And Adrienne had mentioned earlier how topics, some really hot criminology topics are mostly discussed. So we're hoping to dive into why do students feel attracted to these type of comments and what are they talking about and how does that compare to the current society that we're living in? So how students' perceptions are influenced by the greater dialogue, I would say. And who knows? There's so much we can do with these tweets and with Twitter itself, and where Twitter is a public sphere. Anyone here could recall tweets or a hashtag, and you could do a content analysis about that, which is really fun. But yeah, there's a lot to be done.
And just one final note that I want to add, based on Laura's discussion of students kind of buying with this and the levels of study that students are at. So we also found that not only were students in upper level courses and or upper level stages of their academic career more engaged and are able to engage in that critical thinking, they also so in our survey, we asked questions again around motivations or how and why students use Twitter, and they were also more likely to, first of all, use Twitter rather than other platforms, but also see the utility in using Twitter beyond even the scope of the class, but also to, like Laura mentioned, like just engage in discourse and dialogue with people outside the course, network with people perhaps in their communities, in their area of interest for like future employment or volunteering, or basically it's a networking tool as well. And so we're trying to teach students that piece, which also falls into some of our research. And we do see kind of more buy-in and or uptake that already existed and or occurs with students who are maybe at a later stage in their academic career, which is also interesting. So if individuals are interested in thinking about using this maybe not only for an introductory course, but at that higher level, then that most certainly could be beneficial. And students may also see then that utility themselves a little bit more. And so that may play into how well students kind of are able to engage in this expectation or this course requirement. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining this morning and to asking so many great questions. And like we said, we're happy to share any of our kind of strategies around thinking about the use of Twitter and its integration and implementation within your course, or just thinking about maybe what you could do with it, and then also sharing some of our published papers, as Laura mentioned, and or previous presentations if that might be helpful to anyone. So thanks so much.